I was recently asked to put on a number of portable war games at the club to which I belong. What I decided to do was to set up a mini campaign based on the opening moves of Operation Barbarossa, using scenarios that I had used in the past and I knew that would work. I also decided to use a pared down version of the rules as published in the book. Because the people using the rules were novices, I only selected a small range of units for them to use. And I summarised the turn sequence as briefly as I possibly could on the QRS. I also managed to get all the combat bonuses and penalties onto the QRS in a very simple tabular form. However, the rules regarding the resolving of hits were exactly the same as they've been in all the other versions of the rules that have been published to date. The terrain I used was made up from my Hexon 2 hexes, and they were based on a 3 foot or 90 centimetre by 2 foot or 60 centimetre whiteboard. The trees that I used were ones that I bought originally from a model railway shop, and which I improved slightly and mounted in groups. The bridges I used in the games were homemade ones made from 3D, MDF and some bamboo skewers. And the buildings were resin cast huts, or in actual fact garden sheds, that I found online that I painted specially for this game. The first scenario, which I called Battle for the River, is really to recreate the sorts of actions that the Germans fought in the early stages when they crossed major rivers during the course of the invasion, particularly the River Bug. The Germans, who were invading, had 4 infantry units, an artillery unit, a machine gun unit, and a commander, and would become exhausted after they'd lost 9 strength points. The Russian defenders had 3 infantry units, an artillery unit, an anti-tank gun unit, a machine gun unit, and a commander, and they would become exhausted after they'd lost 8 strength points. As you can see, the terrain is set up with a river with 2 bridges over it close to the centre. The Germans advanced from the left-hand side of the battlefield and the Russians from the right. Interestingly, the Germans prevailed quite quickly and pushed the Russians back off the board, causing them quite a large number of casualties. And what follows are some images of the battle in progress. The second scenario dealt with the Russian counterattack that occurred fairly soon after the invasion. The Russians threw every available unit they had towards the invading Germans in the hope they could hold them back and in fact push them back to the original border. To do this, they used whatever troops they had available. The Germans, in this scenario, had 3 infantry units, a machine gun unit, 2 tank units, and a commander, and again were becoming exhausted after they lost 9 strength points. The Russians had 4 infantry units, one of which is a militia unit, in other words, men literally taken from the fields and the factories, given a rifle and sent to the front line, an anti-tank gun unit, a tank unit, and a commander, and they were becoming exhausted when they lost 9 points as well. In this scenario, there's a metal road running across from one corner of the board to the other. The Germans started off in the small town at the bottom corner here, and the Russians came down the road led by their tank unit. They weren't successful in their counterattack, as you can see in the following photographs. The fighting was quite intense, but the German tanks actually won the day quite easily and pushed the Russian infantry back without too much problem. The final scenario was called Not One Step Back, and takes its name from the Stalin order number 227, which ordered no unit should retreat without orders. And it was called the Not One Step Back order, and it's called the Not One Step Back rule in the rules. And to ensure that it was complied with, NKVD units were placed behind the front line with orders to shoot or imprison any retreating troops. In actual fact, the Russians issued a stamp to commemorate this, and any troops that were not shot on the spot were sent back to the front line as what they call strafe units or penal battalions. The Germans in this scenario had 3 infantry units, a machine gun unit, an artillery unit, and a tank unit, and a commander. And again, would become exhausted after the loss of 9 strength points. The Russian defenders had 2 infantry units, a machine gun unit, and an artillery unit, and a commander. But at least they were in defences. However, as soon as the attack started, there was no way that the Russians would retreat, and it was obvious that they were going to suffer horrendous casualties as a result. Now, the Russians were set up on the right-hand side of the board behind some defences that were pinned by woods on either side and with hills behind, and then Germans invaded from the left-hand side of the battlefield. The fighting was actually quite intense. At one stage, the Russians charged the attacking Germans and got wiped out in the process. In actual fact, none of the Russians survived, and as this picture shows, the Germans managed to swarm across the bridge. Some of them actually even waded across the river at a ford that they discovered, and by the end of the battle, not one Russian soldier remained. However, in this scenario, the Russians actually managed to inflict more casualties on the Germans than they'd suffered in the previous 2. So that is a brief outline of the mini-campaign, the Portable Wargame mini-campaign that we fought at my club recently. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have done, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to this channel. In the meantime, have a good day and continue to enjoy your wargaming. Goodbye.